Now we're going to transition over to Colin Ortega's Chapter 5, Democracy. They title this chapter, Was Greece the First Democracy? Let's find out. Okay, here we are again. As all good historians must, we need to define our terms. Now with the word democracy, it's actually pretty easy. It's based on two Greek words, demos, meaning people, and kratia, meaning power, so power of the people. And there are a couple of different kinds of democracy, though. We have direct democracies, in which all of those who are eligible to vote on everything, and I mean everything. Should we go to war? Okay, where everybody has to go vote. Should we fix the potholes downtown? Oh, everybody has to vote. Should we raise or lower the sales tax? Oh, everybody has to vote. So as you might be able to tell, this works well in a small, relatively simple society, but as societies grow and expand and become more complex, this type of governing style is actually a bit more difficult. Another type of, not quite a democracy, but close, is a republic. So, and that's the style of government that we have here in the US, where you elect someone to represent you. And they are the ones who have to meet to decide if we're going to go to war or fix potholes or whatever. So there are different types of governments. They're not all democracies, but what they do have in common is that they are all participatory, which means that the people actually participate in the government in one form or another. We're going to get into this a little bit more here on an upcoming slide, but for right now I want to talk about why is this important? Why do we care? Well, if you look at the picture that Colin Ortega chose to begin this chapter on democracy, it's actually a really frightening picture. You have a gentleman who is being pushed up against a wall by ostensibly US soldiers. This picture was taken in Iraq after the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. And so why is this picture the first image in a chapter on democracy? And they provide a quote from then President George W. Bush about the importance of democracy. So let's unpack this a little bit. Is that picture intended to promote an emotional response? You better believe it is. But why would they do this? Are they just sort of looking for this knee-jerk reaction, or do they have a reason? All right, so we're being good historians here. Let's take a look. This idea of democracy meaning freedom and everybody in the East being under dictatorships and being powerless, this goes back really far, all the way to the Persian Wars and our good buddy Herodotus, who, remember, was not an eyewitness to these events. He's writing in the generation after the Persian Wars. He's actually writing during the period of the Peloponnesian Wars and their aftermath. So historical context when a source is written is actually really important. So he's writing about the Persian Wars, and he's writing about them in such a way so that he's portraying the Greeks as freedom-loving, free citizens fighting for their homes, and he's portraying the Persians as, oh, those soldiers, those sailors, they're slaves to the emperor. They have no choice. They have no agency. And this idea of Greece, and then later once Greece becomes accepted as part of the quote-unquote West, which defies definition, there's this idea that the West is free and that the East is always under some form of subjugative government. This is known as Oriental despotism. And this idea, as I said, begins with Herodotus, but it really does grow over the years. And we see different governments, especially in the West, really use this as a way of legitimizing becoming involved in the political systems in the quote-unquote East, again, whatever that also seems to defy definition, or at least easy definition. So how do we, how do we deal with this? Well, we have this idea that West equals free, East equals unfree, of citizens in the West versus subjects in the East. And Cole and Ortega do a really good job in this chapter by pointing out that this really is based on a historical fallacy. So let's see what they're talking about. Okay, so while the Greeks are the first to invent this specific system of democracy, it is, after all, a Greek word, demos and kratia, right? We do see participation in government long before the establishment of Athenian democracy, or Greek democracy as we would have it. So we see this as early as the Enuma Elish, which we talked about before. We talked about, this is the Babylonian creation epic, and it contains the idea of assemblies of gods. And since Babylon is seen as the earthly representation of the heavenly abode of the gods, we see assemblies of subjects or citizens, whatever you want to call them, in Babylon and other ancient Near Eastern cities and city-states as well. Cole and Ortega give you a couple of examples. I believe you have one where the king is presented with a murder case, and he says, yeah, no, I'm not hearing this. Take it to the local assembly. So this means a group of citizens or subjects who it's their job to participate in the government to decide this person's guilt or innocence. Another way of participating in the government or checking the power of the ruler is the institutionalized priesthood. Now, while the institutionalized religions often serve to legitimate royal power, they can also act as limits on royal power. Unfortunately, Cole and Ortega take things a little too far when they start talking about Africa and early democracy there. The problem here is their methodology. Yet again, they are judging ancient people by the methods of modern groups. So come on, Cole and Ortega, get your act together. Now let's look at a primary source. This is the Law Code of Hammurabi, and it's one of your readings for this week. Now, Hammurabi was the 6th king of the Amorite dynasty. He lived during the 18th century BCE, so that's the 1700s BCE, and he establishes Babylon as his capital and establishes what is known as the Babylonian Empire. Excuse me. So he issues this law code, and we have this law code today. It's chiseled into a stone monument, and at the top you have a pictorial depiction of Hammurabi receiving the law codes from the god of justice, also one of the sun gods, Shamash. And so these laws then are not just the king's laws, they are divine as well. So let's look at these laws and how does this even connect to our topic of democracy this week. So there's no equality before the law. You are judged based on your social standing. If you're a member of the nobility, of the elite, you're judged by one set of standards. If you are a free peasant, you're judged by another set of standards. If you're a slave, you're judged by an entirely different set of standards. So these laws provide different punishments based on both the accused's social status and the victim's social status. Let's take a look at some of these laws. So there's a huge section on domestic law. In all, there's about 282 laws. So you've only been given a very small section here. Domestic law is huge. For example, adultery is a capital offense. So if a man catches his wife or wants to accuse his wife of adultery, they will tie the woman and the man with whom she's suspected of committing adultery together and toss them in the water, in the river. Of course, they're both expected to drown. Now, there's a caveat here, which is kind of interesting. It says that if the man chooses to forgive his wife, then the king will forgive his subject. Meaning, okay, this man has accused his wife of adultery, but, you know, before she gets tied to some other dude and tossed in the drink, he rethinks his decision and goes, well, maybe I was being too hasty, etc., etc., etc. You know, I want her to be spared, but, you know, I don't like this other guy, so he can still be drowned. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. So if you're going to forgive your wife, then the man in question is also to be forgiven as well. Sadly, there are no penalties for a married man committing adultery. Surprise, surprise. Okay, consumer protection. If you are a stonemason and you build a home, but you do a really crappy job of it, and that home collapses and kills the owner, you will be put to death. Remember, there's no prisons here. There's no such thing as going to jail. So all the punishment has to be immediate. Here's another caveat to that law. If you do a bad job of building this house and the house collapses and it kills the owner's son, your son will be killed in his place. So, but the law is put in place to protect people from shoddy workmanship. We also have concepts of civic responsibility. We do have cases where if a judge is accused of corruption, then he won't be allowed to serve as judge anymore. And we see then that this means that there are judges. There are people whose job it is to hear criminal and civic cases. That is a form of participation. We also see an indication, one of the laws where, let's say there's been a rash of burglaries. If the local official does not catch the burglar, that local official is required to reimburse the victims for what they lost out of his own pocket, which maybe that should actually be a modern law as well. But we do see that all of this implies, at least to a certain extent, participation. There is a local government official. That is not a member of the royalty. That's just somebody who works for the government. He's participating. The judges, that's participation. So we do see in this primary source a form of participation. It's not democracy. It's not equality, but it is participation.